Okay, so we're now recording.
Okay.
Duncan, how are you?
I'm very good, thanks, Barry. Good to
Um,
see your smiling face on a screen.
that's right. This, after all the shows we have done together over 20 odd years, this is the first time we've actually done face to face on a screen.
Indeed. Well, welcome to the wonders of modern technology, which we finally start using, 20 years after its release?
That's very true. So, what we're doing is putting it out on audio and also on video. So, why don't we start, as we normally do on our audio program, with your wonderful editorial? Because you come up with some very interesting things about disclosure and about always this magazine, this issue is so full of fantastic stories. I almost don't know where to start. So, let's go back to your editorial.
It's a good issue, I've got to say. It's
Ripper.
it's got some pretty good things in. Okay, the editorial of this issue, we're talking about Nexus magazine, volume 30, number 5. Which has been out on sale in America for a couple of weeks and around the rest of the world for about 6 weeks. For people, I guess only people who have been living under a rock for the last month have not been aware of the significant developments in what people generally call the UFO disclosure process. And by that, we pretty much mean that most of the world believe in UFOs and ETs, and millions have had their own experiences. But somehow we are reduced on the internet to a discussion about disclosure, where disclosure is pretty much defined by the US government, and
Yeah, why do
which
they
I
have so
find a
much
bit
control?
contradictory.
Why does the US government have so much control? Because they're only one government, aren't they?
Well, in the case of the UFO movement, most of the UFO researchers have given the US government this authority and control. And I guess it's because everyone's got a skeptic friend who's never going to believe it until they hear government scientists or a president or a pope saying, yep, UFOs are real, ETs are real. This is the situation. They're good, bad, hostile, or friendly. For most people, that's not going to happen until they hear it from the words of an appointed authority. In the case of ufologists, there is one good side of this. The UFO debate, which kicked off in the public eye, in mainstream media, in a non-derogatory sense, really kicked off December 2017. The newspaper, the New York, I think it was the New York Times, but several mainstream newspapers broke some stories about insider Air Force and Navy and other people who had reported on objects in the course of their military duty and military service. We've got several videos which resurfaced that were referenced, called Tic Tac videos or gimbal videos. And for a lot of American people, this is very exciting, and it generated a whole wave of enthusiastic people who refer to themselves as the disclosure movement. A lot of them are found on Twitter, UFO Twitter. And if you look through the posts, etc., you can see pretty quickly a lot of these people are very emotionally driven and quite new to the scene. Very few of them have any understanding or appreciation of the historical context of UFO sightings in the USA, let alone things 20 years ago, like Stephen Greer's disclosure project at the National Press Club in May 2001, which was getting significant momentum on all levels in many countries. And then 9/11 came along, and just all discussion of UFOs took a back seat, and the US went on and to basically massacre and kill people in countries that most Americans can't even find on a map, pretty much all just to maintain their global hegemony. And this sort of brings it back to, why are Americans so trusting of their own government on the matter of UFOs when they clearly don't trust their own government on any other issue? It's sort of a bit of a, I mean, it's sort of a bit of a contradiction, and the rest of us not in America, and there's quite a lot of really astute UK and Australian UFO researchers, and I say astute because we get the benefit of seeing cases and examples and feedback that the Americans don't see through their ridiculous media filters. And we assess and look at cases historically and think about them across the board. And I would say, for the most part, UK and Australian researchers and non-American researchers are less emotional and more mental. In America, the public is so emotional; they are so easily led by their feelings. You've only got to whip up something emotional on anything, and the public will just, stampede it like a herd of cattle based on emotion. They're that responsive in America to emotions. I mean, Australia and UK on several things you could say are maybe less emotional, but on the matter of UFOs, yeah, it's brought in a whole new crowd. And my editorial on this issue addresses the idea of whether a disclosure is actually genuine or whether it's being controlled. And this is the time for the deep state to come out with a several years long narrative designed to gently bring the mainstream of the public from a state of disbelief and non-interest into a state of awareness. And of course, we've got these background narratives that were leaked into the public domain from insiders like Werner von Braun, the rocket scientist who, in the last few years of his life, was warning his protege, Dr. Carol Rosen, and anyone else who would listen, that the deep state had a multi-decade plan for total control of mankind. And after making out that the Russians were a threat, followed by rogue nations and terrorists, and then asteroids, the final card to be played would be the hostile alien threat. And he stressed that they would spend decades preparing for this. And you can sort of see this happening. And a few years ago, a lot of people remember the big jump in interest when that rock star Tom DeLonge jumped in and created an organisation and tried to sell shares to the public so they could stay interested and possibly invest in his UFO ET anti-gravity technology. And I mean, a lot of people have not a lot of information about how that was started, but Tom DeLonge, the rock star, is actually a Freemason, and he used his Freemasonic family connections because his family were connected into senior people in the US military. I'm talking around the level of a general or a colonel or upwards. And introductions were facilitated using the Masonic connection, and he obviously lobbied a case. And it looked, in retrospect, like it was picked up and then handed over to other key players. And a few weeks ago, all this culminated, if you want to look at it that way, into a congressional hearing where 3 people were brought forward and they testified to members of the Senate and the Congress in some committee hearing. And it was a bipartisan thing. I mean, there were people from both sides of the political fence there listening to it. Some interesting names as well. And for most of us, what was released, we've all heard many, many times before. I mean, a lot of what's put in there, without the specifics of those, what they call the tic-tac video or the gimbal videos, the general consensus has been published in Nexus 20 years ago, and there are probably hundreds of books detailing the details from people with higher rank and higher security clearances, people who 20 years ago, some of these are now dead, others are still alive, but a lot of people scratched their heads and said, why didn't they bring other witnesses forward who had personal experience? The main guy, David Brush, in the middle of the hearing, he is a very respected and highly credible, what I would call, person from the intelligence community who has not personally seen the bodies or the craft, but in his role in the intelligence agencies, people who were personally dealing with such things were reporting to him of their concerns. And so he has a head full of people who are actively with hands-on projects in the deep state and in the secret projects. And so he was reporting this to the world. So a lot of this is now on the congressional record, on the public record. There's been a bit of pushback. Someone leaked the fact that David Brush had a bit of post-traumatic stress disorder. But I mean, who working in the military doesn't really have that on their file somewhere? Yeah. And it certainly hasn't affected Brush's, his integrity, because he's maintained all his security clearances. So obviously the people who are higher up the food chain than Brush are perfectly happy with him. But again, this sort of leads into, is this all controlled leaking, or is this uncontrolled? Richard Dolan, who I greatly respect, has made a video discussing this where he posits the strong likelihood that there is a faction inside the deep state that is not happy with the cover-ups. There are obviously enough people who can see that the technology and the science advancements mankind has derived from working with either downed, crashed, or recovered UFOs and the occupants of the craft, there's obviously the perception that with this technology, we could turn Earth into a paradise planet with free electrical energy, get rid of disease, get rid of pollution, and travel the stars. And I suspect that that awareness is driving some of the whistleblowers' motives, because they can also see that if this is hidden, that the world could end up a pretty bleak and controlled place. Off on a tangent, in this latest issue, we have an article about a deathbed confession regarding the NASA moon landings, the Apollo missions. And it's written by Bart Sibrel, who some people out there would probably recall was the journalist punched by, oh God, I've forgotten the astronaut's name, but he's quite controversial. He was trying to get the astronauts to, yeah, he was putting, yeah, he was chasing astronauts around on camera and basically saying, will you swear on a stack of Bibles? I've got a Bible here. Will you put your hand on this Bible and swear that you went on the moon? And one of the astronauts was so incensed that after being hassled for a while, he turned around and punched the journalist out. Now, Bart Sibrel did present rationally and sanely, and there wasn't a lot of sympathy for him. But look, considering Bart Sibrel's journalistic background as a news presenter and producer, I mean, he is about as high up as you get in the TV world of news, working for the big corporations. So he's not just some amateur. He's actually quite well connected into the news and entertainment industry, won multiple awards.
He's also had several production companies of his own, so he's had
absolutely, yeah. But without going too much down that tangent, my point is that he puts in his book, and in the article we've got there is a definite mention that he has had ongoing contact from people deep inside who've said there are many of us who are very upset with the secrets that are kept about the moon landing. And, some of us may be able to leak more information to you as time goes on. But they've given him multiple messages of encouragement and support and said, just keep going. You have the support of a lot of people on the inside for what you're trying to do to expose the Apollo mission, narrative. So again, you've got a hint of a lot of people on the inside. So getting back to the editorial question, is disclosure real or controlled? And when you take a close look at the people sitting at that congressional hearing, it's very clear that David Grush, the main man who everyone's got their eyes on, has a handler who is sitting behind him and who would lean forward and whisper into his ear how to respond to some of the questions. That handler is being considered by the very enthusiastic people out there as evidence that this is genuine disclosure. But when people look at the handler and his background, I mean, this handler was one of the architects of the Patriot Act, which was ready to roll after 9/11 and basically says America can kill anybody anywhere on the planet anytime it wants, if it wants to, because they might be a terrorist. And on top of that, we can keep an eye on any American anywhere in the world or in this country and do anything we want to them. We can spy on them without being accountable. I mean, it just took the lid off every, bit of accountability and reduced transparency. And this person is CIA. And the other people on the periphery are very deep CIA backgrounds, and they individually don't really have a history or a narrative that they're part of a willing disclosure situation. And I guess the most intriguing part of it all is if you were to look between the lines at what direction is this whole narrative being steered? Is it down the middle, staying neutral, or is there the suggestion that this is a threat to US national security? And right from the time of Tom DeLonge onwards, the hint is this is a threat to US national security. But on that basis, I know several punters are saying, well, if you don't present it down that way, how are you going to get the funding? How is the US government going to take it seriously? And I mean, this is all arguments and things which have been discussed for decades, but it's got to the point now where politicians have had historic meetings with historic insiders, and the public are considering stuff for the first time that's blowing their minds. And I guess they're waiting for a bit of the dust to settle before the next the next thing. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, people who are believing this is a genuine disclosure, people like Jeremy Corbell, who's the chap who's now handling Bob Lazar and making a bit of a mess of it, in my opinion. I think he's raised more questions about Lazar's credibility than he's alleviated. But these people, along with journalist, Channel 7 journalist Ross Coulthart, who used to be on 60 Minutes, he's very much at the centre of this. He made friends with a particular insider and has been the recipient of a lot of other inside information. But in his particular case, he will go to inside media organisations and he'll do a video clip and blow everyone's minds. But again, nothing he is saying is new information in terms of the general narrative. Other insiders were saying the same thing and more, claiming first-hand knowledge and experience 20 years ago. But, you know, it is interesting to see the pickup of a new round of people on the whole thing. My personal gut feeling is that there is a push for a faction of people inside to get this stuff out, but I just fear that when they identify themselves by coming forward and passing on their information to the legal people to represent them, I feel that there'll be I guess my worry is that it's not real disclosure, it's controlled disclosure. They'll control the narrative all the way while hiding their secrets.
Well, they've controlled it all the way so far, haven't they? So why change?
Yeah, and they'll use this process to identify dissident people within their own ranks and then either remove them or cut off their security clearance. So as far as I'm concerned, the deep state is going to win all the way with this. And I absolutely fail to see how or why the deep state is going to go to the public and say, yeah, we've got crashed ETs, UFOs, we've got the technology here which can cure all known diseases, and we've got anti-gravity, inertialess drive, faster than light travel, and we can do anything we want. And we've been testing and working on this with friends and foes out there in the galaxy for decades. They're not going to say that at any point unless they are literally going to skew it to say that it's a threat. And so it's a case of watch this space. In my editorial, I said, so back to the big question, is UFO ET disclosure emerging organically or is it being controlled? And I say in the editorial, my answer is a question. And the question is this: how does one tell the animals on a farm what a dairy is and what it does? Or what the farmers are and what they do, or what their equipment is and what it does? How does one explain to them what cattle dogs are and what their role is? Or why most of the animals are generally cared for and protected from disease and predators? And I had one person email and say, I don't understand the question. Others have obviously understood it, and a couple of people have emailed me suggested answers. But what I'm getting at is that I don't think UFO and ET disclosure is actually a human decision. I think that we've got visitors who've been on this planet for such a long time that they are directly responsible for the rise and fall of most of the major civilizations technologically, and definitely responsible for the rise of, maybe not for the rise, but for the hijacking of all the world's major religions. And it's almost as if we as a species have been farmed. You've got the Russian paddock, you've got the Australian paddock, you've got the Buddhist paddock, you've got the Muslim paddock, you've got the white race paddock, you've got the yellow race paddock. And just like farmers like to experiment with their animals, they like to think, okay, well, I'd like to take this herd of animals in that paddock and make them tick resistant or drought resistant. And they select the bloodlines of the ones who are immune to ticks and crossbreed them and favour that. And I mean, what we do on a farm with animals, and most of the time, the average farmer is going to care and love his animals and, you know, protect them from predators, protect them from disease. And it could be argued that the animals on a farm actually have a better quality of life than if they are fending for themselves out in the wild with predators, disease, having to really push and find food and water, etc. It's an interesting debate, but not many people look at our Earth situation in that context. And given the historical evidence for ETs and UFOs, I mean, right back to the Bible, angels and Ezekiel's chariot, you've got every indigenous culture on the planet talks about beings from the sky, and they always refer to them in examples of lots of different species. There's never a uniformity into one single type visiting us. There's lots of types visiting, some similarities in them. And all indigenous cultures have an understanding of which types to avoid and which types can be useful or helpful. So it's definitely not a new narrative. And when you look at the role of religions in our past, you could definitely, I mean, the priests of tribes and civilizations, technically the priests are the ones who speak to the gods. Priests were always the ones who you went to and got permission to marry somebody in your tribe or in your family or in your area. And the priests were the ones who would check that there was no interbreeding or intermarrying, and they would give permission based on that. And most of the kings of Europe were controlled by the Pope or the priests who gave the pharaohs of Egypt gave. I mean, they were not the top of the tree. It was the priests. The priests says, yes, you can be pharaoh, and yes, you can marry this person. And the priests were the one who controlled the banks, the banking system, and the economies. So the priests, the people who are these mysterious priests, actually held the most power. And what was their role again? To communicate with the beings who came down from the stars. So I think there's a lot of our own history mankind is yet to resolve, and how the UFO disclosure thing is going to play out. I mean, most people think disclosure just means a bunch of Americans are going to wake up one day and be told by their government that we're not alone in the universe, and we may have some of their stuff, or we're working on it, and we'll let you know what we know when we know further. And that's enough for them. But for other people, it's going to be a continual series of unpacking the big debate. Well, who are we in relation to these ETs, and what was their genomic and genetic makeup when we've started examining them? And on that note, there's an article in this issue of Nexus.
For a moment there, for my audio listeners, we might take a break in a moment, but it just it occurs to me that when you're talking about the animals, it brings back thoughts of Animal Farm, where all animals are created equally, but some more equal than others. So one of the articles you wrote included in Nexus is that exobiospheric organism story, and that says a lot.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. It's not unusual for genuine insiders to defect to their conscience and want to leak stuff to the public. The big problem for them, and I've spoken to a couple of these people, so I've sort of been walked through their thought processes. The big problem for them is, where do you choose on the internet to leak this? I mean, you can email it directly to people like me, and that happens a lot. And sometimes mischievous people send me stuff which looks incredible, but after investigation, it's all bogus. And the trick, they were attempting to get me to embarrass myself by publishing easily provable nonsense. And it's come close a couple of times. There's some pretty dedicated people out there. But with this particular guy, he posted on a forum called Reddit. Reddit is considered pretty woke. And if you are a dissident thinker, you are likely to be banned or have your posts removed. During the COVID thing, any dissident thinkers to the government narrative found their accounts suspended, posts removed, blocked, or pushed further down so that it wasn't seen. I mean, you get the picture. But they do have a pretty active and interesting conspiracy forum and UFO section. And the interesting thing about places like Reddit is it attracts all the skeptics and few believers. And some of the skeptics actually have a really good role. I mean, they're quite diligent and can weed out a lot of possibilities of what things are before they get too far. Now, what was really fascinating about this one was this guy obviously had it pre-written somewhere, and he cut and pasted it onto a new thread on Reddit and prepared to start answering questions. And it was only minutes, maybe 15 minutes or so onwards, that his questions started being removed. And when the Reddit, some sub-editors and Redditors, as they call them, when the moderators of that particular forum went in to look at what was going on, they checked amongst themselves. No, none of the moderators had removed anything. And they're sort of thinking, how's this possible? To cut a long story short, the deep state showed itself very capable of reaching into another part of the internet, like a forum many layers down on Reddit, and remove things as they were being posted. It scared the crikey out of the Reddit people because they'd never seen or heard of this happening, and many of them confided in each other. They didn't even know that it was possible. I've been told by big level insiders is that if something accidentally makes its way on the internet, it won't last more than a few minutes. And the powers that be can just dive in anywhere, anytime, and remove it from a distance, despite any firewalls and login passwords, etc. It's so this is a case when this has happened. Now, next level in, when you actually read this guy's narrative and his testimony, it is very detailed and very technical, and anybody with any human biological expertise has looked at this and gone, oh my God, this person, I understand what this person's talking about, and he knows what he's talking about. You'll have to read the article to appreciate the deal. But what really caught my eye was that he was discussing the genetics of one of the occupants of the UFOs that he was working on or reading the report about. And interestingly, if you want to call it, the DNA of that ET was made up of a lot of human DNA. And it sort of makes you think, well, this looks like a type of human that's been modified and now would be presenting more as a humanoid ET, right? But eukaryotic cells, which is what human cells are, and with a lot of our genomic material in there to say that this is very likely to be a human or a crossbreed, as it was speculated on some parts of the internet. And I thought that was really interesting. I'm of the, well, let's put it this way. I could be of the persuasion that planet Earth was one of the first petri dish planets. And from here, the humanoid life form has been spread around the galaxy, and which is what a lot of ETs have come here and said. But it could be that Earth was the first petri dish planet, and there's a lot of reasons I say that, but I won't go into it in this discussion. So, where are we? What would you like to discuss next?
Well, I was just going to say a little bit more about the biological system of the, like they call them the EBOs, and so very similar to us, but there are major differences. But I think that's an integral part of that particular article.
Yeah, look, there is the hint that there's absorption through the skin, the glandular system, organ system is different. I sort of think it becomes a bit of a moot point. I mean, I would say that each species that visits here is going to be different and yet the same.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's going to be an interesting situation. But having in retrospect, all discussion of that that leak or that thing on Reddit has stopped, and there's no, in the disclosure movement, there's no more discussion on it. It's like everyone agreed that this is way above their pay grade and understanding what's written in there, and then let alone deciding whether or not it's applicable to any part of the narrative. So for a lot of people, it's another leak that doesn't really go anywhere, except for some of the researchers who are looking for tidbits to either validate or denounce a line of research they've got or where they're going. But in my particular case, there's enough in there to suggest that to suggest the farming narrative that I was talking about, that there's ongoing genetic modifications and changes. And I mean, I think I've mentioned on this show before, I've been told by insiders that the junk DNA in humans is actually like a reservoir of possible transformations that could be made to the humanoid life form, in terms of, with some tweaking, our skin could become thick and scaly. With other tweaking, we could start sprouting wings. Other tweaking, we could grow gills. There's a lot of variations of the humanoid form that can be arrived at, apparently, by tweaking our so-called junk DNA. And I'm sure that earlier civilizations of higher technology and visiting civilizations would be well aware of that. And if that is the case, it would make humans, especially Earth humans, it would make them like like a master template that you could buy or borrow or rent or steal, or come to an agreement with, where you take some humans and that DNA is tweaked and you've got a human colony on a planet with a stronger gravity or a different atmospheric content, and our lungs are modified to handle, say, more nitrogen and less oxygen, or a different gravitational thing, and our bones are made stronger, or something more exotic. So I believe in the future, when we start analysing the DNA of a lot of the visitors here, people are going to be surprised to how much human stuff is going to be in the more humanoid life forms that visit us.
Yeah.
And yeah, so this article goes towards validating that.
Fair enough. Now, if we can change subject and come up with a new direction for a moment, the new energy base. So we've got so many problems around energy, and well, they're playing out in this country right now with a bunch of idiots trying to send everybody into blackness. But the new energy breakthroughs, freeing the spirit of power for the people. Now, there's some wonderful information in this one.
Indeed, written by Gene Manning, and people who've been reading Nexus, or people who've been researching free energy or anti-gravity or alternative energy, will recognize the name as being there for decades. Gene Manning, I believe, worked with Nick Begich and provided a lot of the science material regarding exposing the HARP complex in Alaska, which was first exposed by Nexus magazine before
Yeah, I
anyone
had
else.
Nick on the program as a repeat interview a couple of months ago. Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful man. Haven't heard from him
And
for ages.
the reason for this article is it's a bit of a roundup and a bit of an update on quite a few of the people and projects that Nexus has reported on over the last 25 or so years. And people have often said, oh, you know, whatever happened to Moray's work or Bedini's work, etc. So this article addresses a lot of mad scientists who were alive and coming up with very interesting things, and haven't been updated for some time. It's by no means a comprehensive roundup of them all. A lot of these are American-based, and these are the ones that Gene Manning is familiar with. But there are a lot out there. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And unfortunately, many of those hundreds I've never covered in Nexus, purely because of language and cultural barriers. But I can assure you that what we affectionately call mad underground scientists, who get devices working which produce more electricity than they consume, or people who have achieved anti-gravity as a result of their research, and they find things floating around in their air or shooting through the roof of their workshop and disappearing into space. Or cars running on water, which was the big deal back in the 80s, before water became more expensive than petrol. But there were so many people in Australia and New Zealand who had cars running on water, and it was the same right across Europe. And as Nexus spread into more and more countries, I got quite a few letters from people who could either write in English or could get somebody to write from Bulgarian into English or Serbian into English. And you would not believe how many people in European countries have got, how many scientists have found and discovered a lot of these same things. The shame of it was, back then, nobody talked to each other because they didn't know about people on the other side of the planet or the other side of their country who were working on pretty much the same thing, but without any communication with each other. The internet caused some people to reach out and communicate, but some of these dudes were already pretty protective. Others wanted validation of all their years of ridicule and abuse and being sacked from proper universities to, and of course, very few of these got any funding. So unfortunately, I've got to report the number of new mad underground scientists coming onto the line is not happening.
Well, what's
The younger
the purpose of
generations
this
are not
article
interested
then?
in,
What's the
the younger
purpose?
generations are not interested in picking it up because and they don't even know this, most of the younger generations indoctrinated into current science thinking would need to unlearn a lot of what they were taught about biology, physics, and oh yeah, in order to comprehend and even to get their head around the approaches taken by some of these so-called mad underground scientists. And that's just not going to happen. The people who are making these are people who questioned science decades ago, and since then science has doubled down on funding and promoting narratives which it wants known and denouncing other ones. And we see this in medicine and biology. I mean, on one hand, science is progressing, and it's been very clear that there's no way any cell created itself out of a prebiotic world from some swamp. Even if the Daleks had turned up and gave it a boost with a lightning bolt or something, it's not possible. And we know this because we can now peer inside a basic cell, and it's like a self-running city. We don't even know what part of the cell makes the decisions about why it needs to transport a bit of genetic material from this side of the cell to the other side of the cell. And we don't know, I mean, we do know that when the cell decides to send a bit of itself from this part of it to that part of it, the cell creates a type of scaffolding joining the two parts of the cell wall. And then the little thing is transported along it to the other side. And then the cell dissolves the scaffolding. Mission accomplished. We don't know what part of the cell makes these decisions. I mean, it's assumed that that process is a result of a environmental response or a stimulus as a result of something touching it, something lodging on a receptor site. But it's not. And the few people looking at that at the coalface are just going, evolution is bunk. It's not physically possible. And it's the same with, I mean, one of the books I'm reading at the moment, just have a look if I can find it, highly recommended. I mean, this is me unlearning what electricity is, what I was taught about electricity in school. And when you read a book like this, and Ken Amdahl, remember Amdahl computers back in the 80s and 90s? Yeah. That's him. He's a genius. But he is basically.
For my radio listeners, what's the title of that book?
There Are No Electrons. Because we're taught that electrons are the outer shell of atoms, but in this particular case, this book's all about electricity. And we're taught in school that electricity is the apparent flow of electrons, blah, 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 blah. This book demolishes it. And it demolishes using existing science. And so you've got so many parts of science which have now been convoluted. So the final thing that's taught to teachers is not questioned. The teachers don't have the full picture enough to question what they've been taught. And so they teach the students. If we are lucky, there'll be a student or two who goes, wait a minute, if one law says you can't create energy and matter out of nothing, then how come the Big Bang happened? I mean, I'm giving a very obtuse example there, but
it's one in the case of electricity, topics,
there's a lot of things inside electricity and what it does that we have no idea. And I had no idea until I started reading that book. I just knew that there was a big debate about whether or not electrons existed. And I was curious about how it applied to electricity. And I'm still curious how it's going to apply to valency in chemistry. So that's a bit more reading in my spare time. It could be a subject of another magazine article, and we'll be talking about it again one day. Mm. But back to this article, this is a bit of a roundup of many technologies we reported on in the last 20 years, where they went, a bit of an overview on where we're going, and very interesting the conclusion of Gene. Gene basically says the technology to turn this planet into a paradise already exists. And
of course it does.
It's being suppressed. And,
But whoever comes up with the answer, and there's several very interesting people in this article, it's going to be repressed because there's no money in it for the big people. There's no money for the oil companies. That was an engine that was suppressed in Australia back in the 1960s. And the oil companies bought out the patent, never heard of it again. So whatever.
Oh, over and over again. I mean, basically, it's a lottery. I mean, just in Australia and New Zealand, I mean, I'm familiar with many case studies. And again, none of these researchers knew of the existence of anyone else. Some of them go to the ABC and they secretly test it with the local ABC radio for weeks until everybody working at that ABC studio is either using the bloody stuff in their own car and seeing for themselves that it works. And then they go public. And even then, well, I guess my point is, if you go to the media and convince them and then go public on the media, the chances of you being found dead the next day are very low because you're already high profile. But if you haven't made a lot of noise yeah, the chances of you dying with your secret are quite high.
Yeah,
It's
that's
like they
happened a
do
lot.
a personality. It's like they do
Mm.
a personality assessment, and they sort of think, okay, will this person take the carrot, or will this person need the stick? Is this person so stubborn-minded that they won't take the carrot or the stick, and they just got to have a car accident, or could we offer them a position in a university in exchange for them keeping quiet for the rest of their lives? I mean, all of these things are considered, but the one that's the safest is usually applied, and a heck of a lot of them to this day are still found dead. There was one in America got a car driving on water. It wasn't even a particularly radically new one, and the next week, some woke person who decided he wanted to go out and kill someone that day caught a bus on a 7-hour trip, went to that person's place and killed him, and it's listed as a random murder by a
Oh, just
mentally
by
ill person.
coincidence. Yeah.
I
Mm.
mean, I've seen and reported on this for decades, so I get a bit blasé about it. But to see it happen only a couple of years ago in America, it indicates that they are never going to take this and apply it to the public. And I mean, from one point of view, I've got to say, looking at some of the people out there and how extreme they've been conditioned to become, how full of hate they are, whether it's religious, cultural, gender, and political, there's no way you could right now release that technology into the general public, because if it was made freely available, people would be using it to kill each other, kill enemies. So in many ways, you've almost got to keep the lid on that technology until either the general public are awake and aware and spiritually evolved enough to utilize it responsibly,
That's a
or
big
until
call. That's a big call.
you've got total control. You reduce the population of idiots until you've got total control of the rest of the sheep, and then you utilize that technology without telling them how it works, but to improve the lot of their experience on the farm called Earth. So I suspect the latter is what's going to occur, which just makes for a pretty bleak future. But there
Rather
again,
dystopian. But we are in the age of all, aren't we?
well, we're in the age of infinite possibilities. It almost feels on some mornings when you wake up. But I mean, there's a great awakening happening
Mm.
still,
Yeah.
and
Well, as I said on the program before, when Pluto goes into Aquarius next year full time, that is when technology is going to start to really move forward a lot. And I wouldn't be surprised, having read this article, that we're going to see a lot more technology in the whole energy area, because that affects the entire world, doesn't it? Everybody. We have to keep the lights on. We have to keep electricity, energy flowing. But
oh, Barry, I've got to tell you, your prediction is probably going to come true, but not in the way that you think. Because I mean, the plan is when they've got total control of the public, the plan is they're going to release a solid state energy device, which you won't be able to take apart and figure out how it works. But there'll be a certain size for appliances, there'll be another size for vehicles, and there'll be one for the house. And you'll rent them or borrow them from the deep state, assuming you've got enough social control points and money and you're an improved person. But they do have a contingency to put in place for once they've got total control, and we won't be using hydroelectric power or nuclear power. I mean, basically, we're only using steam power. The coal we dig and burn is used to heat water, which causes steam, which turns turbines and creates electricity. Nuclear power, they just use enriched. I mean, the nuclear. Everyone thinks nuclear power and they think Simpsons, but the nuclear power, it's just a huge kettle. It's making steam from super hot rocks. Everything we're doing is designed to make steam. We are still in the steam power age. And people sort of think, we're in the atomic age. No, the atomic age is only being used to either kill people or to boil water. It's the insanity of it. So I predict they're going to go for total control, reduce the population, and release solid state energy units to the few humans who are remaining compliant.
well, I
And
hope you're wrong.
I hope I'm wrong too. Believe me, I really hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, look, there are hints and there are hints of narratives which I call savior narratives or hopium narratives, and there's plenty going around with Nasara and Gassara and Trump and friendly aliens and all the rest. But there's been a background narrative of mankind's consciousness moving in two different directions simultaneously. And I know that every listener out there would 100% agree there's two camps on the planet at the moment. Those who are awake and in the process of awakening to the nonsense that the mainstream believe. And then you've got the mainstream who've pretty much doubled down on believing it because they are the herd. And the herd is scared, easily manipulated and steered.
Well,
And
they've been made to fear. They've been put in that position of
yeah,
control.
and it's because all their crime is they've trusted the authority people.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe the secondary crime is that they're ignorant and don't want to become informed because they don't have the confidence in their own, abilities to process and understand information. It's made worse because the herd is continually being attacked by their mobile phones, phone towers, TV, high definition TV screens. I mean, there's so much technology being employed to keep humans in a type of mental, emotional state of what do you call it? Of readiness to fight or flight. It's there's a word for it which is escaping me, and that's the herd. So there are a couple of narratives we've discussed these before. An Aboriginal guy was literally taken over by the Great Spirit, told that in the very near future, mankind will be split into two streams. It's not a good and bad. It's like a soul decision before you incarnated. And there'll be a classroom for the herd, and there'll be a new classroom for the people who've left the herd and want to explore living in harmony and in cooperation with nature, and no wars and no illness and all of that. And interestingly, in this issue of Nexus, I found another source for that narrative. And it happens to be in a book written by a guy called Michael J. Rhodes.
I was going to ask you about that. Yes, a wonderful book about Pan.
Yeah. Now, he has written, 20 books, New Age metaphysical books, mostly based on his metaphysical adventures. Now, he's one of these few people who's able to get out of his physical body, if you want to call it that. And over the decades, his metaphysical body has been really kicked in. I mean, he's able to visit dimensional realms of experience and energy that take and require some handling in order to be there and have a perception of what's going on and then relay it back. So to his credit, I actually believe the validity and the integrity of what he's writing because I've seen him all my life and I've seen demonstrations and examples of it.
So wouldn't happen to be your father, would he? No.
Well, there you go. So it's not often that you find in New Age consciousness books a conspiracy rave worthy of being found in Nexus magazine. But in my dad's latest book called Pan and Me, Pan has been like his non-physical guide for a couple of decades, and not always there, but he's there in the background enough so that Michael always has the experience and the learning himself without being overtold. So it's like a teacher that leads you into understanding things that you didn't understand before without forcing or confining your choices. And so there's a point here where for the first time Pan says to Michael, haven't you ever wondered why humans are taking so long to evolve on planet Earth into a spiritual civilization? He goes, well, I did wonder. I just thought it was normal. Pan goes, no. He basically says you've got humanoid families with reptilian bloodlines that have been here for thousands and thousands of years, ripping us a new one, totally controlling us, stifling us, wanting to hold us back, wanting to control and manipulate us. And he basically says they're the ones in control of everything behind the scenes right now. But he says in the very near future, mankind is going to split into two streams of consciousness. And again, Pan is saying, like the guy told the Aborigine and what Dolores Cannon and other people found, it's not a judgment of you've been bad or you haven't, done this. It's a soul decision made by your higher self before you were born about which, path you're going to go on. Both are valid. And Pan says at the end of the day, all souls in creation come back and have their time and become fully awakened and fully aware. It's no race because we've created time in some places in order to have the experience. So time doesn't matter. You can take and make as much time as you want. But yeah, to hear it coming from Pan in my dad's book, I thought to myself, this is very interesting. I'm going to do an extract and show the readers that it's not just conspiracy thinking, but it seems to be recognized as a matter of fact by beings of, who are pretty out there, and so it was pretty cool. And yeah,
Hmm.
maybe. I mean, I don't want to say that it is going to happen, but you know, it's it could be hopium. We'll have to wait and see.
That's what I say. Well, it does in the article. It does say that choice is our birthright, according to Pan. Unfortunately, humanity has endured many thousands of years of conditioning, so mass consciousness subconsciously resists a higher frequency, and that is something we have to really take in and understand, don't we?
Absolutely, and it's. I mean, you know, what I've extracted and written down is so brilliant and understandable.
Mm.
That's why I know it didn't come from a dad; it came from Pan.
Oh, no,
But I
I've known
mean,
Michael for a long time, worked with him.
no, it's all
He's
right.
a very intelligent
He'll
man.
laugh. But I mean, this is new stuff. This is new stuff. I mean, my father was aware of my conspiracy research, but for most of that time, he just thought I was under the influence of some shady people. And, you know, New Agers don't want to believe that, you know, there's a conspiracy to, you know, to enslave you, and that they're using the New Age movement as much, you know, to do it as much as anything else. I mean, do not fool yourself. There was awakening in consciousness, but the CIA were absolutely ready. The vegan movement, most of the New Age movement, was, you know, from the deep state. They were trying to control a lot of the narratives.
So this has been going on for a
Channeling
long
is,
time, this whole
yeah,
control.
channeling is one of the narratives they definitely sought to control by having false channelers putting out stuff, which would then taint the water for anyone else channeling in the future. So anybody who is receiving information from a non-physical source while in an altered state is never going to be taken 100% seriously.
No.
Um, the nearest one to that, in my opinion, is what Dolores Cannon, Michael Newton, and those sort of people were doing, which is putting people in a altered state, regressing them, a relaxation state, and then talking to either their higher selves or their souls or whatever thing you want to label it as, and they're extracting very specific and pertinent information about that person's alleged past lives, future lives. In the case of Michael Newton, there's a lot of exploration of what that person experienced after they died last time, all the choices, decisions, and things they were presented with in the in between lives. So that sort of information is still coming through and out there. But again, a lot of people are cautious and skeptical about it. They want to compare it to something they already hold as true.
Yeah, but
And
as you
so
know,
we are in very interesting times.
I've written 3 books on the afterlife, life between lives, past lives, and so on. And I know that I get a wonderful reaction, and I'm just one of many. And I think people are waking up, and they want to understand that there is something beyond the madness of this materialistic society that we live in. They want to know that there's more to life than just living for a while and dying and disappearing into a mud somewhere. And I think right now, as you said before, we are on the verge of really changing and maybe splitting humanity, whatever. But right now is a very integral time as far as humanity is concerned.
Absolutely true. Right now, and I mean, I say this probably the last 4 times on your radio show, I'm bowled over and astounded by how many people who just 2 years ago, 3 years ago, identified as a total mainstream doctor, virologist, medical specialist, and without question, everything they've been taught in university, medical school about vaccines, disease, germs. There are now so many thousands of medical experts who have totally reversed what they stood, the ground they stood upon for 20, 30, 40 years of their academic life. And these people are now saying there has never been a single virus ever that's been isolated and shown to exist as a cause or a mechanism of disease contagion. So these people are, and I'm not talking bacteria or fungi or parasites, I'm talking viruses, which are quite specific for those who haven't bothered by now to go and have a look at what a virus is in terms of size compared to a cell. Viruses have no cells. Bacteria can have one cell or more, or ditto with fungi. But to see these people changing what they believed so quickly and so profoundly, and they're now waking up and embracing other things that they had taken for granted as true, but are now starting to question. So there is a great awakening of people who you would have said 5 years ago, these are herd animals, they're never going to change. But COVID came along and everyone had a different experience of COVID, depending on where they were. And for a lot of these people, COVID was the wake-up call. And to see people renouncing the existence of a virus, viruses are basically the foundation stone upon which big pharma has been built, and big chemical and big agriculture. Since 17, God, you could go back to 1530, but I started at 1796, which is only a couple of decades after white people found Australia officially and put it in the British almanac, even though other white people from Holland had found it earlier, and not white people from Indonesia and Southeast Asia had come here pretty regularly. But you can see my point. 1796, they started vaccinating people for the first time in England. And it's based on the whole thing that all these plagues and things, they were caused by something called a virus, and this is how we're going to treat you from now on. So we've got over 200 years of brainwashing and conditioning. And in that time, parents have grown up and taught their kids who've had children and grown up and taught their children. The medical system, look how many thousands and thousands of medical papers have been built on this pile of stinking bullshit. And I read, and unless you read and quote these papers built on a foundation of nonsense, you won't get passed into medical school, or from medical school into doctor. You won't get your doctorate. We have had centuries of absolute nonsense, and to see that level of awakening occur is just astonishing. And all I can say is I just hope it spreads and keeps going, because it's probably one of the ways out of this mess, in my opinion.
Well, there's a really good article in the current edition of Nexus on that, so I'll let people buy the magazine and read that for themselves.
I was hoping we had time to mention it. It's an article by Tom Cowan, and who's getting a lot of credibility out there. And basically what we do is, in layman's language, we put, you don't need a medical degree to understand this, but this tells you how, in theory, viruses are isolated in the laboratory. And when you read what is required, you realise it's a total nonsense. But in medical school, nobody isolates viruses. They build upon what's gone before. And so when you build upon what's gone before, if what's gone before has been deliberately corrupted and distorted, then you're screwed and you're living in a land of make-believe. But somewhere behind the scenes is a bunch of scientists in underground bases that know all this, and their understanding of medicine, biology, energy is completely different. So how the world is going to integrate that parallel civilization that branched off about 100 years ago and is under the control of God knows who is another mystery, and maybe a topic for another interview.
Yeah, all right. Just to wrap up, going back to what I regard as the major feature in the current edition of Nexus, the Deathbed confession, NASA faked the moon landings. So you just give a little brief summary of what you think about that, because to me, it was a real wake-up call. I think it will be to a lot of people as well.
Well, look, for most of my Nexus life, I just assumed that the moon landings were real. When cracks emerged in the narrative, I was aware there was a narrative against it, but I couldn't really find anything to get my teeth into until our UK editor, our UK office, Marcus Allen, he was very involved in researching that. He started shoving stuff under my nose, and I had to concede that I got to the point where I said to him about 15 years ago, Marcus, officially I'm thinking we might have gone to the moon, but I reckon that we used technology that they wanted to hide from the public to do it, because the current technology we had back then is so problematic that we were able to do it using that technology. I'm talking the shielding for the heat on re-entry, getting through the Van Allen radiation belt with 3 humans aboard safely, and back again, escaping the moon's gravity wells. Oh, and the one that gets me the most, and I didn't even think about this until Elon Musk successfully did this a few years ago. You know how NASA sends rockets up, does testing things, and because NASA can't land them again, they crash into the ocean, and now and again they might be retrieved and cut up as scrap or reused. But basically, it's a big waste. And along came the billionaires who started making their own rockets. You know, what's his name from Virgin, Elon Musk, and a couple of others. Bezos, I think, had rockets, and
it's the in thing.
Richard
Yeah.
Branson. But Elon Musk took the lead, and his whole thing was, I'm not going to waste rockets by crashing them into the ocean. That's just a total waste of investors' money. I'm going to land those rockets back down after they come up. So the rockets go up, do their things, and then he lands them on their bum, on their bottom,
Yeah.
you know, with flames coming out the bottom, and it's controlled and controlled and controlled until it lands. The first time he did that, it was historic in the media. Nobody watching that sort of thought, oh, well, that's what the moon landing people did every single time, first time, you know. And then you go back and you look at the first Apollo mission and all the early Apollo missions, and you look at how many times they practiced a human landing of just the moon lander bit that landed on the moon, not the full Saturn V rocket. I'm talking just the easy bit. They could not land that lander on its bottom manually or with models. What's the word for it? I'm losing my track here. They couldn't do it in simulations, is the word. They couldn't do it with simulations, and they couldn't do it with anyone really doing it. So the very first time man landed on the moon, Armstrong took control of a malfunctioning landing thing and landed it perfectly on the moon, first time in history that had ever been done, even in test. That started to stretch my belief in it all. And so I dived into what the naysayers were saying and quickly realised that all the naysayers who started the ball rolling, questioning whether or not we went to the moon, were people who were quite involved with NASA and had perspectives that would allow them to see the nonsense and the contradictions. Anyway, getting back to this article, Bart Sibrel has been the guy we were talking about earlier who punched out Aldrin. Asked him to swear on a stack of Bibles that he landed on the moon, and the guy punched him out. And a lot of people sort of thought, well, you know, yeah, you were in his face, but a lot of people thought, well, why didn't he do it? Why didn't Armstrong do it? Why didn't any of them do it just to settle it for once and for all? Because they didn't. And I think, if anything, that didn't, I think it sort of backfired in the public. And I think a lot more public started thinking, well, especially non-American people started thinking, well, that's really strange. They could have done it. And then people go back and they revisit the famous press conference they first had after these three astronauts and quarantined and whatever. They were sitting there looking really glum and disinterested. They weren't looking elated and victorious and happy whatsoever. They had long, dour faces. And
well,
they weren't
somebody might say, well, hang on, after all the stress of going up there and coming back, they would be exhausted. So that could explain that.
They could have smiled a bit more. I mean, they certainly had the energy. I mean, this was days and days afterwards. They had been, you know, decontaminated, quarantined. It wasn't just like they got out of the rocket and driven to a press conference. Nothing like that at all. And but the other thing was, I mean, they were asked what were the stars like, and one of them said, "Oh, you know, they looked fantastic." Now they said we couldn't see any stars. He had a direct contradiction in the first press conference. So things like that shouldn't happen. And it started the ball rolling for me. But anyway, so Bart Sibrel comes along, and he's been, if you like, the lightning rod or the go-to person for people who want to leak stuff in America. And, you know, he's a professional media and news producer, reporter, etc., with decades of mainstream news experience. So, you know, he has protocols he follows, and it's obviously worked. In this particular case, you had the security officer in charge of one of the entrances to a massive tent facility in which they recreated the surface of part of the moon and proceeded to recreate moon landing and filming it with cranes and gantries, etc.
They were in two aircraft carriers. Apparently, they were in two aircraft hangars, giant ones, which were linked together to give them all that space.
Yeah. And sorry, hangars, not tent. I'm thinking of James Bond.
It's not moon race.
And so, yeah, this guy was in charge of security at one of the main entrances, and he had a list of 15 people, and if they weren't on that list, they had to be sent away. There were other entrances to this facility, and other security guards manned those entrances, and the lists of people there were different. And I would like to see the other lists, because I reckon Stanley Kubrick's name is going to be on one of them. Anyway, the list of people that were allowed to enter the facility through his.
Starting off with Lyndon B. Johnson, of course.
Yeah, it's a list of 15 people, and most of them are known: Lyndon Johnson, Neil Armstrong, Edward Aldrin, Werner von Braun, Robert Emenegger, a bit of a UFO researcher. A lot of people surprised to see his name in there.
And guess who he was? Yeah.
Eugene Kranz was NASA flight. Yeah. Eugene Kranz, he was a NASA flight director. James Webb, a lot of people hear about the James Webb telescope and all the findings. That's named after him. He was an administrator at NASA. Then he got an astronaut, Joseph Kerwin. He was a future astronaut. Thomas Paine, deputy administrator at NASA in 1968. And then Glenn Lundy, a flight director from NASA. Christopher Kraft is from NASA. James Van Allen, after whom the Van Allen radiation belt was named, had permission to enter through there. Arthur Trudeau, who was Army intelligence and linked to the UFO cover-up himself. And two unknown people, one called Donald Simon, one called Grant Nuri, and it's speculated that they're either CIA or civilian intelligence people. And now, what other thing interesting about this whole film was shot in June 1968. It's a year and a few weeks before the supposed infamous moon landing. And it had a project name. The project name was Slam Dunk. So this guy who in charge of security, he felt really bad about it as he got older, and he made a deathbed confession, which was videoed and given to his son. And his son has eventually passed it on to Bart Sibrel. Bart has sat on this for a while, honouring the requests for it not to be released until the son had died. The father obviously already died. So, I mean, such is the fear of retaliation and punishment and amongst these people. So Bart honoured the request and released this about a year ago. I think we reviewed his book, The Moon Man, and this article is extracted from several parts of The Moon Man. So it's got the list of 15 people. It's also got his mention from another chapter of the other insiders who've given him encouragement to keep going, and confirming that they know full well that the Apollo moon missions did not happen as we were told. I still have not ruled out that they went to the moon using other technology, and that's why they filmed this one, because it was what was shown to the public, in my opinion, was staged. But it is possible we went to the moon with other technology in another type of craft with another type of propulsion. Yeah. But I think it's going to be a long time before we get to the bottom of that. The bottom line for most people, as time has gone on, nobody has been back. And NASA has made public statements in the meantime saying, you know, we're preparing the Orion mission, and we've still got to learn how to get through the Van Allen radiation belts with humans without frying the equipment. And you sort of think, well, wait a minute, we did this with all the Apollo missions. What are they talking about? And there's more and more comments have been made by modern astronauts, which basically hint that we've never been through the Van Allen radiation belt. Otherwise, you know, we'd be using past knowledge and past technology. We're still learning and probing it in order to fine-tune sending a human through it for the first time. And so in many ways, on the conventional NASA technology path, it's pretty clear we haven't sent a human through the Van Allen radiation belt using conventional technology.
Well, it's tens of thousands of miles thick, isn't it? I mean, to get through it, and apparently the radiation level is incredibly high.
Well, mankind made it worse. Operation Starfish Prime, they thought, oh, maybe we can take some atomic bombs up there and blast a hole through the parts of the radiation belt. It just made it so much worse. And I think from memory, Operation Starfish Prime, I think it took out 30% of all satellites in orbit at the time. Oh dear boy, humans have done some funny things.
Oh, we haven't.
And most other humans don't know and will never know. No, so it's a very interesting article, and there's a lot of specific detail in there, and there's a lot more available if people want to chase it up. This is a nudge. Now, I know a lot of people out there are very firm about whether this happened or not. All it takes is, my dad was best friends with somebody at the Parkes Observatory, and all these details and things were ongoing during the mission, so I know it was for real, or, et cetera, et cetera. There's just as much stuff to suggest that all the observatories and official observation places were compromised and were being fed data and telemetry that was from a simulation.
Well, the whole
Who
thing
knows
is,
how it was done, but I mean, it was well done, and the main thing is no one has been back ever since. I mean,
no.
China last year sent a probe up unmanned and successfully landed on the moon, and that was pretty historic. The Russians, the Indians attempted it with Chandra 2, and it crashed into the moon. Chandra 3 is about to try and land, and that will be historic, and the Russians are following. But you know what's really weird? And I think this is in this article mentioned too, or maybe it's a news item. But when the Indians and the Russians go up, they have an agreement with NASA to not go anywhere near where NASA landed. And why does India and Russia even obey NASA's demands? What hold has NASA got on them? NASA hasn't been sending probes there themselves, and yet, the India goes cap in hand to NASA and makes an agreement with them. And India seems to be more able to do things than NASA right now. So why is India sort of nobbling itself in deference to NASA? What hold have they got? Have they got a base up there that's going to shoot them down unless they obey? I mean, there's so many more questions emerging when you start looking into this about why we didn't go back and why we're sending unmanned ones there with such importance.
And of course, the computer technology at that time could not even power one of our smartphones in 2023.
I mean, you'd think the shielding technology would have improved, the propulsion technology. I mean, Werner von Braun, as soon as he was told about the plan, he said, well, it's going to be impossible with Saturn V rockets because we'll have to build a whole new rocket. And he told that the size of it was like 30 stories or something ridiculous.
Empire State Building height, yeah.
Yeah, just to get the technology into space. And he was saying we're going to have to create a space platform, send stuff up there in these ginormous rockets, and then send it from the platform to the moon. It's the only way it's going to work. And then after he was brought aboard, he shut up about all that.
But he also said they had to have the same technology to come back again. So they needed twice that amount. So, yeah, he was a pretty smart guy. Duncan, look, it's a fantastic article, and I urge everybody to read it. Make up your own mind. And, well, as I said, so many stories in the current edition of Nexus magazine. I'll put it up there on the screen for those people who are watching it on YouTube at the moment. But it's a great edition. Duncan, wonderful to talk to you as normal. We could talk forever, but I know you're a madly busy man. So thank you once again. Fantastic.
Very welcome. And thanks to everyone listening.
And watching.
And watching.